It's because I agree with the old adage that if you give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day, but if you teach a man to fish, he'll eat for a lifetime. That I agree with this resolution. People should not give money to beggars. Now, before we really rock and roll, I just want to define one quick term here, just in case things get weird. Money, what we're clearly talking about here is cash or money given to a beggar, not other things you buy with that money, such as food, gift cards, assistance, a blanket, anything like that isn't money. The negative, their only job is to show why we should give money to beggars. Everything else is pro territory. With that in mind, I have one clear standard for the resolution or way you should weigh it, and that standard is effectiveness. You should weigh this resolution over whether giving money to beggars is effective for those beggars. Will it help them alleviate their poverty or homelessness? If it will, go ahead and vote con. If it won't, vote pro. With that in mind, I have two main arguments under here. The first is that giving money is not effective. Now, there are two reasons why you're giving money is not effective. The first you can write down as enables addiction. This is backed up by any study you look at. The Department of Justice did a study in 2006, I believe, where they found that the typical panhandler was unemployed and had a substance abuse problem and wasn't looking for a job. The Transit Authority did a study in 1989 looking at subway panhandlers and found that the majority of them were males with mental illness suffering from substance abuse. The Department of Housing and Urban Development found that 60% of homeless or impoverished individuals were addicted to drugs or alcohol. Thames Reach, a British organization, found that 80% of the people they get within their own shelter use the money that they get from begging for drugs. And this was backed up by the Metropolitan Police of that area, which said that 70% of the people they arrest test positive for drugs. Here's the issue. When you give the money to a homeless person, the homeless community, the beggars, those people, they are majorly addicted to drugs or alcohol. And that's where we think the money can go. You have no accountability here. The second reason is it just plainly isn't helpful. It just plainly isn't helpful. The average panhandler, according to the Institute of Urban Studies, makes $10 to $30 a day. It's not helpful for actually alleviating poverty. It doesn't do anything. However, this doesn't mean I'm saying that you should just say, oh man, these poor beggars can't do anything about that. You have two alternatives, and that's under my second argument, be effective. Two alternatives. You can either give help, lunch, food, a blanket, shelter, a job. You can give something that's concretely and tangibly helpful. I carry around non-perishable food items and give them to homeless people instead. You can do exactly something like that. The second alternative is give to an organization such as StreetLink, John 3:16, other organizations that will actually help these homeless people find shelter, find homes, find jobs, find food, and find money. These are effective options. Giving money to beggars isn't.
All right. I used to agree actually with the affirmative. I would pass someone on the street and I think to myself, well, if I give him money, he'll just use it to buy drugs or alcohol or whatever. So I use that as an excuse to avoid them. If someone would ask me directly for money and I had time, I'd say, I don't have any cash on me, but I'd love to buy you lunch. Sometimes they'd say yes, and I'd buy them lunch at some fast food place nearby, talk to them for a while. Sometimes they'd say no. And then I would pat myself on the back because I just knew that I'd been a great judge of character because the only reason anyone would ever right? It's because they were addicted to drugs. Anyway, so one day late last year, I bought Popeyes for a guy in Union Station here in D.C., and we started to talk about his life. He tells me his wife kicked him out a couple months before, and that he can't afford to move into his new place. So he's staying in shelters as much as he can and trying to save up money to buy a cheap used car so that he has a better method of transportation and some place to sleep and keep some of his things behind a locked door. Now, that story may have been complete and utter bullshit. He could have been just a really good con artist for all I know. I certainly believed him at the time, and I gave him some advice. And then I said, well, I hope you enjoyed the hot meal. He thanked me, and then he said that was the third hot meal he had that day for lunch. And he said people keep offering to give him food and things like that instead of money. He says, well, I don't turn down a free meal, but I can't buy a car with food. And I think that's what part of the issue is here. There's kind of a three-step argument here. One, we should give something. I would assume we're in agreement on this. That's not that controversial. Two, different people have different needs, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution to those. And then third, giving cash allows the recipient to prioritize and to make their own decision. I mean, one of the fundamental concepts of free market economics against centralized planning and what I would call is that people know how to allocate their resources to meet their own needs better than anybody else does. That's what we see in large-scale tests in regards to public assistance, government welfare, etc. And that same approach works on the small scale, and so that's the case that I'm going with here. So I agree with you that there are plenty of other ways to help, but to discount cash as a method of being able to help, even slightly, altogether, is not prudent, and that's where I'll leave it.
Awesome. So, do you think the resolution applies in the majority of circumstances? Like, just most of the time, you think people should give money to beggars? Is that what you're saying?
No, I think that I think it all depends on a case by case basis. Like I said, some people are going to decide, well, I've got $5, I'll go spend it on some beer, right? I mean, frankly, if I was sitting at the corner asking for money all day, I'd probably need a drink too. No, every case is different. And so I think that, first off, even if it is true in the majority of cases, that still is not to say that it is bad to give money. Maybe to give money at the exclusion of all others, maybe. Money certainly isn't the only way, and it certainly shouldn't be done in a vacuum. It should be part of a comprehensive approach. However, to discount giving money entirely is not a wise way to approach it.
So my opponent makes some arguments talking about how different people have different needs and that people should be allowed to make their own decisions. I want to point you back to the analysis I brought up about how the majority of beggars are addicted and do spend the money on drugs and alcohol. My opponent says, oh, but we have to evaluate this on a case-by-case basis. The question I ask my opponent is, how do we know? You're on the street, you have money, you see a beggar. How do you know? Do you know if he's in the majority, or how do you know if he's in the minority? So the clear issue you can write down as exception versus the rule. My opponent's personal example is very compelling. He says that there are examples of people who are trying their hardest, and I absolutely agree. I think I'm not trying to discount the majority of beggars or anything like that. However, I would say that this statistically, according to the multiple studies I brought up, is the exception rather than the rule. Yes, that's true sometimes. That doesn't mean that you should give money to beggars, because most of the time you're not going to know. If you have time, yes, take that person to lunch, ask them, try to figure out their motives, etc. And then maybe you can give money to them if you think that's appropriate. However, let's go ahead and recognize that the majority of the time that's not going to be the case. The majority of the time what's going to happen is you're walking down the street, you see a beggar, and you're faced with a split-second choice. You have a meeting in 10 minutes, and you could either give them $5 or walk away. Or you could choose the alternatives, which is what we both agree, you should do something. You shouldn't walk away. And the alternatives aren't just hot meals. That guy receives 3 hot meals. That's not all you have to do. The 2 things I do, I carry around non-perishable food items, talking like cans of food, granola bars, things that he can eat later. That way, on Thursday, the day or whenever, he'll actually be able to have food instead of just receiving that hot meal that day. And the second thing is I carry around shelter cards. John 3:16 Shelter has cards that have a phone number on them that if you call, will come and they'll pick you up and help you find a job and give you shelter, clothing, food, etc. So if you truly want to be able to get money, let's remember again that it's not helpful. The second point of my argument was that it just plainly isn't helpful. The average panhandler makes $10 to $30 a day. It's not the most efficient way to make money, and encouraging it encourages people to continue to panhandle, which isn't the effective way. The effective way is to go to these shelters that we can donate our money to and actually learn how to get a job. So when we boil it down, here's what it comes down to. Panhandling will be used wrongly. Beggars will use the money wrongly most of the time. Statistics back that up. If they're not, it still isn't effective. You have multiple better options available to you. So do the beggars.
All right, so first, a couple of studies, so I'll toss a couple back your way. David Evans of the World Bank and Anna Popova of Stanford University. They did a study and they examined they took 19 different studies and kind of threw them all together. And they all assessed the impact of giving cash to the homeless instead of in-kind benefits. And not a single one of those 19 studies found that there was any increase in tobacco and alcohol consumption. In fact, a few of them actually saw a decrease. The researchers also conducted a meta-analysis, a statistical technique for kind of combining the results from across different studies. And again, they said that overall receiving cash actually slightly reduced tobacco and alcohol consumption. According to a study in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, a foreign aid charity called Give Directly that you might have heard of, they use this approach for foreign aid, giving no strings attached cash, and they've had good results with that. From the study, they said that overall they have had a significant increase in the monthly flow of non-durable expenditure, from the equivalent of $36 relative to a control group of $158. With the exception, they actually said, with the exception of what they called temptation goods, which are alcohol and tobacco, they saw an increase of expenditures in all other categories, including food, medical, and education expenses. And that goes back to a fundamental principle of free market economics. Libertarian Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman was a huge advocate of this through the basic income model of government assistance. He called it the negative income tax. There have been other variants of that throughout the policy world. But to go back to kind of your main 2 points, right? The first one being, okay, they're going to spend the money on drugs, so they might spend it on something else. First of all, I am impressed that you can just tell by virtue of someone being poor on the street that they're making incapable of making good decisions. There's a huge difference between a panhandler and a beggar. Panhandling is a profession. That's someone who does that full time. Begging is simply an act that can be done at any time. I'm a busker in Washington, D.C. I fall under some categories of being a beggar. And I can assure you I make a lot more than $30 a day sitting out there. Or maybe they're not really poor, right? Maybe they're faking. That is certainly an argument to discern, to be discerning. But that is very, very different from saying that as a rule, you should not give money to anyone who asks for it. I think that just as a matter of charity, you're supposed to meet the needs of the individuals. And frankly, in a lot of circumstances, I'm not going to know the needs of the individuals as well as they are.
I just want to ask you a quick question here. Do you think that my job under the resolution is to prove that 100% of the time nobody should ever give money to beggars? And if you can provide an example of one time when it was appropriate to give beggars, you should win? Or just mostly that in the majority of cases, people shouldn't give money to beggars? And that's what I'm trying to prove, or that's what I should prove.
No, I'm not arguing there's only that a single case disproves resolution. What I am arguing, what I believe I will prove, is that in order to prove the affirmative, you have to make the case that, as a rule, individuals should not give money to beggars. The question at the end of the day is, should we give money to those who are asking for it? And the answer is yes. That's not the only thing we should do. It's part of a comprehensive approach that includes churches, food banks, homeless shelters, and public and private charities and nonprofits. But nobody's going to be worse off by virtue of having $5 more in their pockets, and a lot of people will be better off, even if only slightly. Obviously, we should use discretion, but the claim that it is on principle bad to ever give money to beggars, it doesn't hold up. Like I said, you can't with food, and no amount of rules and strings attached to money or extra rules that we put on top of that, as making us the decider of what somebody's needs are. That is not it's not an effective way to actually meet the needs of the people that are asking for the money in the first place.
Just make things really clear, and you can nod. I won't waste any more of your time asking questions. You're saying I have to prove the resolution true in the majority of cases, right? Just a quick nod if you agree. Oh, you don't agree. Okay, so you're saying I shouldn't prove it as a principle. Can you explain what you think I should be able to prove then as a principle?
As a principle, it's not simply a matter of 50% plus one of the cases. It's about saying that the amount of good that is done by virtue of giving money, right? If I give $5 to 100 people, hell, if 90 of them go and blow it on drugs, the other 10 might do something good with it. And the fact that I've helped those 10 people is completely worth the other 90%. It is not my job to make sure that everybody I try to help makes wise, fiscally responsible decisions. My job is to help people. And there are plenty of ways to do that. There are effective ways, there are ineffective ways. But I'm supposed to use every avenue at my disposal. And if I'm walking down the street and I've got $5 in cash on me, that's what I'm going to give them.
I think my opponent is trying to say here is that we're going to be looking at the benefits, the net benefit approach to the resolution. Essentially, if giving money to beggars hurts them on a whole, as a general rule, as a principle, hurts them more than it helps them, then you should vote pro. If it helps them more than it hurts them, then vote con. I think that's a pretty solid way of measuring it. We should be looking at what does more good than harm. So my response here is you shouldn't hurt 90 to help 10. Under what he's talking about here, he says, well, if I give money to 100 beggars and 90 of them go and they buy and they spend it on drugs, it's okay though, because 10 of them bought lunch with it. Let's remember that that's not true. It's not just that these 90 have the exact same life as before. It's that their addiction is enabled by our giving. The analysis under here is that the majority of people in poverty and homelessness are addicted. He brings you the study from the World Bank, Stanford University, saying, well, it doesn't affect substance abuse. My response is beggars versus foreign aid. His study, based on what I understood, based on the words he spoke, it was reflecting foreign aid. Said this is what they use for foreign aid, is they give it to these people and they give cash and it's better. So my response is beggars aren't foreign aid citizens. What we're talking about here is the typical beggars you see on the streets. We're not talking about, Bosnian refugees or anything like that. We're talking about a beggar you'll encounter on the sidewalk. And when we look at the studies that look at those people, the people who are homeless and begging, we find that the majority of them do spend their stuff on substances. Department of Justice, Transit Authority, the Institute for Urban Studies, Housing and Urban Development, and Thames Reach, as well as the Metropolitan Police, all support this. It's pretty indicative that when you look at actual charities who have to deal with this issue, almost all of them say you shouldn't. I mean, I can read you off the list here. There's Central City Concern, Human Solutions, Transition Project, Community Hope, Family Solutions, John 3:16, Onawim Christian Church, which is a church for the homeless, the Northwest Pilot Project, Portland Rescue Mission, Director of Public Policy at Transition Projects, Street Roots, the Western Regional Advocacy Project, the U.S. Department of Justice. They all say you shouldn't give money to homeless people or the beggars, people who are asking for it. Why? Because, as we talked about, in the majority of cases, it does enable addiction and it isn't helpful. There are better ways for you to spend that money if you want to help. We should be looking at two things here. One, does it harm? And yes, because it enables addiction. And two, can you help better? Yes, that money that you have, invest it. If you, every time you saw a beggar on the street, you decided, okay, the money I would give, the $5, I'm now going to invest that in John 3:16, or I'm going to spend it to a shelter, or I'm going to buy food for a food bank. That would all be more helpful and not harmful.
First off, the guy sitting at the corner is going to be relieved to know that I gave an extra $5 to my favorite NGO. No, the fact is here that we have to allow individuals the ability to make their own decisions. The definition of paternalism is the policy or practice on the part of people in positions of authority of restricting the freedom and responsibilities of those subordinate to them in the subordinate's supposed best interest. And this is what we see with a lot of these maybe well-meaning charities. I also think it's kind of funny that you cite all of these charities which are kept in business by homelessness and which are funded by donations, saying, don't give money to them, give it to us instead. I don't think that's necessarily free of a conflict of interest. But like I said, you have to allow individuals the ability to make their own decisions. I'm sure your parents gave you a small allowance when you were a kid. You probably learned some basic personal finance skills by virtue of having a little bit of money to manage. Maybe you saved up for something like a new video game or a bike. Maybe you spent it on a bunch of candy at the first store you went to. Personally, I always put all of mine into savings accounts. Learning to budget is important. You can't do that if everything that you receive is in kind. The goal here is not just to put someone in a house. There's already a government program for that, which you fund with your taxes. It's not just to give someone a meal. You already do that with your taxes as well. You can contribute to charities that fund those causes as well. No, at the end of the day, getting out of poverty is not just a matter of having a checklist of certain things that you have to do. It's about having the skills to escape. And one of those skills is the management of finances and the ability to learn good decision-making skills. And that is something that you just can't do by giving somebody a pizza or giving somebody even a bed to sleep in a homeless shelter. Those are all good things, but they're not teaching the actual skills that are needed to escape poverty in the first place.
Sure. My opponent compares giving money to a homeless person as me receiving an allowance. The biggest difference here is 60% of kids who receive allowance aren't addicted to hard drugs. 60% of homeless people are. And if my opponent thinks that you can just separate these two issues, like cocaine addicts are really good at making decisions with the money given to them. That's not true at all. There was a study done. I just pulled it up here. It was by a lot of really smart people. I can send it in the comments if you want to see it. I can't pronounce any of the scientists' names, but it's called Emotion, Decision Making, and Substance Dependence, Modeling Addiction. And they found that substance-dependent individuals, the majority of beggars, show signs of impairments in decision-making characterized by a tendency to choose the immediate reward at the expense of severe negative future consequences. The issue here is if you give a cocaine addict money, that addiction hijacks their brain, is that they will then go buy cocaine with that money. That's what shelters help with. Shelters help you be able to do what my opponent wants you to do. My opponent wants beggars to be able to make their own decisions, to be able to move forward. I want that as well. And the best way to get that isn't just to give a cocaine addict $10. The best way to give that is to give a cocaine addict treatment. That happens at shelters. That happens when you give them a card for John 3:16 that has a number on it that can pick them up and take them there and get them rehabilitation and get them treatment. What we're looking at here is the fact that the majority of beggars are addicted to hard substances, cocaine, heroin, anything like that. And when we give them money, psychologically, what they will do is spend that money on immediate reward. That's what the psychology shows. That's what the studies have shown. So absolutely, it does more harm than good. And if you truly want to help a homeless person, you truly want to help a beggar, the best way to do that is long-term investment into an organization that will help them find treatment and will help them rehabilitate.
All right, first of all, there's another important definition that you've missed here. We're talking about resolution. It's about beggars, not panhandling, which is a profession, and not homelessness, which is a symptom. Not all homeless people are beggars. In fact, the vast majority of people who are recognized as homeless don't actually beg on the street at all, and they're not truly homeless in terms of sleeping on the street. I know people that beg and then go back to a home at the end of the day. So using the terms panhandling, homeless, and beggar interchangeably is not accurate. Like I said, there's a very important difference there. And like I said, there are 19 different studies that are not about foreign aid, that are about domestic pilot programs in developed countries that choose to use this as opposed to systems like food stamps, housing assistance, TANF, different benefits like that, different pilot programs that different countries, mainly in Europe, a couple in and a few in the US back in the 80s that used what were called basic income models of welfare distribution. And like I said, none of those 19 showed any increase in the money being used on drugs. And in fact, a few of them actually showed that when there was a little bit of financial stability by virtue of them having a source of income, the use of drugs actually went down. So correlation there and causation are two very, very different things, right? There's a difference between being homeless because you're addicted to drugs and turning to drugs because you're homeless. But again, we're not even talking just about the homeless. We're talking about anyone who begs.
Okay, so a quick question about your study. Was it talking about when people gave cash to homeless people, or did the organization themselves give cash to homeless people?
It wasn't an organization. They were distributed through government pilot programs, which, again, centralized, right? But the small scale, large scale, it's the same impact, which is that people are making the decisions with the money that they are given. And it doesn't matter where that money comes from, because the nice thing about money is that regardless of where it comes from, it spends the same wherever you want.
So the big difference we need to look at here is people versus programs. My opponent says, oh, well, when government programs give homeless people, do good things with it. Well, first off, let's look at the resolution real quick. It says people should not give money to beggars. Now, I don't think it's referring to the government and what the government should do. It's about what you and I should do. And I think that should be pretty clear. And he's going to come up and he'll tell you, oh, but it's the exact same principle. Let's remember that it isn't. There's a huge, huge difference between beggars, people who are on the streets, and people coming up to them and then giving them money. People saying, hey, here's $5 on the streets, etc., moving on, versus a government program that distributes money to impoverished individuals. Now, the two distinctions that disprove this study are programs versus people and beggars versus impoverished people. Now, this study didn't look at people that were begging for money, looked at people who were in poverty and found that. The people who are begging for money, as my study showed, my opponent says, oh, they're just panhandlers, etc. Yet there's no studies that are done on the word beggars. Okay, the studies look at panhandlers, they look at homeless people, they look at poverty. Those studies showed that the majority of them are likely to spend it on substance abuse. So when we, at the end of the day, his studies talk about how when government programs give money to impoverished people, they spend it well. My studies show about how when normal people, the resolution, give money to beggars, the beggars spend it on substance abuse.
Okay, wait, so does the resolution, do your cases show that giving money to beggars increases substance abuse? Do your studies not use the word beggar at all?
The studies look at panhandlers, which is essentially the same thing. I'm assuming your studies don't mention the word beggar either. The word beggar isn't in scientific or political discourse.
No, I'm saying that the principle here is those who are poor. Right? Those are the people that are going to be begging. Again, different from panhandling. But the fact that you're cherry picking sources here and then saying, oh, well, his sources don't count because they're not using the correct terminology in the right circumstance, whereas mine are. If you want to throw out all the evidence and say that none of it is using the correct terminology, I'm fine by that. But I don't think that that is a direction that we want to go.
So to be clear, are you saying that your study didn't talk about programs giving money to impoverished people, and it did talk about normal people giving money to people who are asking for it on the street? Is that what you're saying?
No, I read my sources, all 19 of the studies, to circumstances in which individuals were given money by the government. But it doesn't matter where the money comes from, right? It doesn't matter if I get paid $5 for my job or $5 from busking or $5 from my side gig as a referee. The money is the same, and my decision-making process with all of it is the same.
Right. Okay, so the clear distinction we need to make between my opponent's studies and mine is he says begging and panhandling are different because of semantic differences in how much you beg, saying panhandlers are just beggars who do it a lot. Let's remember what begging is. It's asking for money on the streets. Let's remember what his studies are. His studies are people looking who are in poverty, doesn't look at if they're asking for money or not, doesn't look at if normal people are giving them money. It just says government programs given to people in poverty do well. That's not indicative of the resolution. The resolution asks us if people, normal people, you and I, should give money to beggars. As we found out, that's not true because the majority of them are addicted to substances and will on drugs and alcohol.
Again, there is not a substantive difference between where the money comes from. And the money is going to the same. I don't know if you've ever been on government welfare. I haven't. But I've done an extensive amount of research, and this was the topic of my senior thesis, was basic income. And the trend that we see over and over, if you want government assistance, you have to go and, guess what, ask for it. You don't just automatically get placed on a room. You have to go through a process, paperwork. It's actually pretty onerous, and that's a completely different issue that should be addressed. But it's not just as simple as the government cuts you a check, right? It takes effort, small amount of effort, but it takes effort to go and do that.
That's exactly what I'm saying. It takes effort to receive government benefits. You have to go through the process, you have to be vetted, etc. It doesn't take effort to go out on a street and ask for money. That effort implies somebody who's actually trying to get better.
If you were trying to get better and you needed money, what would you do?
I would get a job because I'm not addicted to substances.
Oh, you would just get a job. That's the solution for poor people. Just get a job.
No, solution for poor people is rehabilitation through treatment centers, as we've talked about extensively.
Okay, so what is the point here of the rehabilitation, right? Is that the sole goal? Is that the only metric by which you can define whether or not the money has even made someone's day a little bit better?
Off of drugs and into a job.
Getting somebody off of drugs into a job, wonderful goal, right? My $5, I would much rather give the guy the money, let him make the decision, right? $5 to a charity, right? Some of which don't even give their money to the right people. Look, drug addicts can do well at jobs. I've had a friend that was absolutely addicted to drugs, which was unfortunate, but he did a good job at his jobs. And the idea that, look, you can't buy a car with food, and that